Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 GSHA Virtual Business Meeting and Conference. We hope you enjoy our presentations over the next 2 days. And please be sure that you are muted and your video is off. Of course, questions will be taken at the end of the presentation using the chat box only. And please direct your chat questions to everyone or to me as the host, and not to the speaker. Okay. It is my pleasure and honor to present Mr. Rob Martinez. Rob is the New Mexico State historian, born and raised in Albuquerque, a graduate of the University of New Mexico with a BBA in International Business Management. Rob then went on to pursue his interest in New Mexican culture and history at the University of New Mexico, earning an MA in Latin American history with an emphasis on church, cultural, and social practices of the Spanish colonial period in New Mexico. Rob also worked for 14 years as a research historian for the Sephardic Legacy Project. Mr. Martinez's presentation will be They Pass for Spaniards, Caste in Colonial New Mexico. I'll turn it over now to Rob.
All right. Thank you, Ed. Thank you for that nice introduction. I'm Robert Martinez, State Historian of New Mexico, and I'm going to be spending the next 30 to 45 minutes talking to you about casta, caste, racial mixing, and identity in colonial New Mexico. The title of this talk changes from time to time, but today it's called They Pass for Spaniards, Caste in Colonial New Mexico. This is a topic that's very dear to me, and I think it's a very important topic. It's significant, especially when you're doing your genealogy and your family history, and you're trying to figure out, who am I? Where do I come from? Where are my ancestors from? Am I one thing? Am I a mix of many different things? I always tell people, when you're going to study history or genealogy or family history, you have to be brave, because you never know what you're going to find when you start digging into those deep roots into our family history. And we people here in New Mexico have quite a brilliant and amazing history. So I'm going to be talking about this very subject, this mixing of various bloodlines and cultures in New Mexico. And there'll be a little bit of overlap. I know Jose Esquivel's giving a talk similar, but his is going to be different. He's going to look at some Native American mixing in New Mexico, but I'm going to be talking about that, but other mixing going on as well. So let's get started. Look at this quote by Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. She's the famous poet, philosopher, theologian of Mexico. She wrote, translated, of course, she wrote in Spanish. This is a translation. Not to be born of an honorable father would be a blemish, I must own. If receiving my being from no other, I had not known it was his alone. Far more generous was your mother when she arranged your ancestry, offering many a likely father, among whom to choose your pedigree. I love that quote, because you need to know that Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, she was born out of wedlock. She was born out of wedlock. And I love this because we have so many stories in our own families like this, my own included, where either in our immediate families or a generation or two or 5 or 10 generations back, you run into a family line where the person is born out of wedlock, or it says de padres no conocidos, of unknown parents. They probably knew who the parents were, but they're not writing it down. Nonetheless, this is indicative of what happens when people are having children out of wedlock, and oftentimes mixing cultures, mixing bloodlines from various different types of people. This is from the 1600s. Let's go to the 1800s. Pedro Bautista Pino, he was a Nuevo Mexicano who in 1812 represented New Mexico at the Spanish Cortes at Cadiz. He wrote in Spanish, of course, this is translation. In New Mexico, there are no castas of African origin. My province is probably the only one with this prerogative in all of Spanish America. At no time has any casta of people of African origin been known there. Spaniards and pure Indians that are hardly distinguishable from ourselves are the ones who make up the total of 40,000 inhabitants. Well, we could forgive old Pedro Bautista Pino for stating something that actually was not true, but he didn't have DNA testing. He had not done his genealogy. And by that time, from what he saw, he was speaking the truth. But in New Mexico, there had been castas of African origin in the 1600s and the 1700s, we'll see. And they came up here from Mexico. As far as Spaniards and pure Indians, he is talking about Españoles. We'll find out what that means. And I love the phrase in there, they are hardly distinguishable from ourselves. That says a lot. That's a loaded term right there. So let's keep that in mind. He's saying the Hispano people and the Pueblo people and the Genízaro people are kind of, in many ways, one and the same. So let's move on. Just for our periodization, I want you to, for this Casta talk, I want you to keep this in mind. The Hernán Cortés conquers Tenochtitlan, the city of the Aztecs, in 1519. By 1535, you have a viceroy, Virrey Antonio de Mendoza, in place in Mexico City. That's significant because we're ruled from Mexico City. We're not ruled from Madrid or Toledo or Sevilla. We are ruled from Mexico City, starting in the 1500s. Our colonial period stretches from 1598 to 1821. Then our Mexican period, 1821 to 1848. Then from 1850 to 1912, we're a territory of the United States. And then statehood finally arrives in 1912. It was a long haul, a real struggle to get that to happen. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But I want you to know that I want you to keep in mind that in the colonial period, it's not like we're just one kind of people, and then all of a sudden, 1821, we become a different kind of people. We're evolving and changing over the centuries and through the generations as cultures and bloodlines blend and mix. So what's happening in Mexico is happening here as well, just like it's happening all over the Spanish Empire. Look at this map of the Camino Real. It's very important because it's this Camino, this royal road that carries people, culture, foods, animals, diseases, north and south from Mexico City to Santa Fe here in New Mexico. It goes through towns and cities and villas like Querétaro, Guanajuato, Aguascalientes, Zacatecas, very important in New Mexico history, as are Durango and Cuencame. Parral, of course, Chihuahua, Paso del Norte, that's Guadalupe del Paso. It's today Juarez, which was part of New Mexico during the colonial period. And then in the Mexican period, it is separated out. And then through to Albuquerque and Santa Fe. So let's look at Nueva España, what's now Mexico in the 1500s. Starting in the 1520s, the ideal was that there would be a República Española, a Spanish republic, and a República India, an Indian or native republic. Again, that's the ideal. But then the realistic situation starts to change over the years. There were few Spanish people compared to Native Americans in that period. And initially, the offspring of a Spaniard and an Indian was considered Español. They would just call the little baby an Español. But this starts to change as the population of mixed blood people starts to overcome and overtake both those of Spanish origin and Native American origin. By the 1600s, things start to change even more as Africans are brought to New Spain, Nueva España, as slaves and also as free people. Initially, the native peoples of the Americas were enslaved, but then the crown and the church said, no, you can't do that. That was made illegal, although there will be loopholes in New Mexico in the 17 and 1800s. However, this also starts to change things in Mexico. At first, there were striking contrasts, again, between the communities of Indians and Blacks, Spanish and Indians, and Blacks and Spanish. But things start to get complicated and complex when interracial mixing starts to take place. And that happens out of the gate. So, officials start to wonder, what do you do about all these people who do not fit in the easy and simple black and white definitions? So I want to emphasize by the 1700s in Nueva España, Spanish colonial society is racially and ethnically complex. This is also the age of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, when it becomes very popular to start studying and categorizing animals, plants, but also people. And this is where we start to really get race-obsessed categorization in Nueva España, Mexico, and also we'll see in New Mexico. And it happens in the Philippines too, and in South America and Central America and the Caribe, the Caribbean. So what is caste? The word is casta in Spanish, and it's a system of dividing society into racial and ethnic categories. And it was very strict when you went to places like Mexico City or Puebla, but also very fluid in outlying areas like Nuevo Mexico, New Mexico. In fact, you could get into trouble in a place like Mexico City or Puebla if you were not Spanish, but you were trying to pass yourself off as Spanish. Not so much in New Mexico, we'll see. So where we really start to see this happen is in church records, but church records and civil documents there's a lot of overlap because of the union between the state and the church in the Spanish Empire. The Council of Trent between 1545 and 1563 really starts to create a system where priests are supposed to start recording the sacraments, because so many people are starting to move around the world because of exploration, colonization, and settlement. So you had to be able to prove you had been baptized, you had been confirmed, and that you had the sacraments, and that you were properly married, and that you weren't married somewhere else if you were going to get married in a place like Mexico or New Mexico. So by 1585, records of baptisms, marriage information, those were diligencias matrimoniales and marriages, burials, these were separated in New Spain based on Spanish, Indian, and casta designations. And I want to throw this in. This is also the main reason it's very difficult to trace our families back before the mid-1500s, because there are almost no documents, no sacramental records, because mainly they kept sacramental records for the nobility, for the king and the queen, for people who had wealth. The rest of us, our ancestors just probably were born, lived and died in the same town, and the priest knew everyone. And so nothing much had to be proven. He knew everyone and just baptized them, married them, gave them the extreme unction, the last rites. By 1603, though, in Nueva España, you start seeing the first casta registers in the Sagrario in Mexico City. That's the cathedral. If you've ever been to Mexico City at the Zócalo, that's where we first start getting this. And it creates a lot of confusion, because even the priests are having to deal with this new way of categorizing and designating people. And we'll see, if you've ever done genealogical research, I have in Mexico, sometimes you'll find españoles in the casta books, or castas in the española book, or españoles in the book of Indios. It gets really mixed up, and humanity and humans start to get mixed up too. There's a lot of ambiguity, confusion, and even indifference, because a lot of these priests, as we can imagine, their main concern is to get people the sacraments. The mestizo designation is very inconsistent. Again, sometimes in casta book, you'll see different categorizations. You'll sometimes find mestizos in Espanol books, sometimes in the Indio books. And by the 1800s, the crown insists again that priests must record the casta calidad, at least the quality, which might not seem like a big deal, but what this means is the priest is often just kind of looking at somebody, either how the baby or the parents look, how they dress, how they talk. And so you get the calidad, the quality of their caste. The bishop orders priests to register that they at least administered the sacrament, but that the rest was not that important, whatever they were told about casta or what their arbitrary perceptions are. There's an interesting case from the 1700s where a man is going to marry a woman. They're both of the Espanol class, and they go to get married. So they look for their baptisms, and the bride's baptismal record shows up in the book of Castas. Well, he is very concerned about this because he is of the upper classes, like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. He can't be marrying somebody from the mestizo class or castizo or mulatto. We'll learn here in a bit. If you don't know what those terms mean, we'll talk about it. But he needed someone of his class. So they go before the civil authorities, or I think the civil authorities, or maybe even the Inquisition, to clear this up. And I researched the family, and surely she's in the book of Castas, and probably because she had some Native American and or African ancestry a few generations back. I found this. I want to talk a little about this because it's an Inquisition catalog title page for a document I found while doing research in Mexico City at the Archivo General de la Nación, the National Archives. The title page says Memoria de los Sanbenitos que se pusieron en la iglesia catedral de esta ciudad de México el año de 1667. That's a list of Sanbenitos. These were the vests and the crimes that showed the crimes of people brought before the Inquisition that were hung in public, so everyone could see what the family had done, how they were shamed in Mexico City. And it's interesting, there's about 390 people listed in this over the course of over about 150 years. But it's people who are accused of, in Mexico City, of being Judaizers, crypto-Jews, judaizante, or Protestant, Luterano, or trafficking with the devil, tratos notables con el demonio. I bring this up because it's such an international list. These people are all blending in Mexico City through the centuries. Mainly African people or mulattoes, half Spanish and half African, are accused of witchcraft or a pact with the devil. But you see a lot of people from Spain, Portugal, Mexico, France, England, a mix of humanity. That's an example of the page, these pages right there. So calidad versus status. Calidad de casta was often secondary to one's station in life. What often mattered was if you were wealthy or whether you were poor. If you were wealthy, you might be designated as Español. If you were poor, you could be designated as a mestizo, a darker skinned person. Also your job, if you were a merchant or a blacksmith versus being a farmer, somebody who worked with their hands, worked farming, worked in the earth. How one dressed was important, how one carried themselves. Skin color also mattered, but could be secondary. But it was also a system of looking at the different shades of your skin tone. So the casta system in Spanish colonial Mexico had, about 18 or 20 different mixes. Nobody could keep track of this. At the top, you had Español, and India would bring a mestizo, an Español, a mestizo, a castizo, and an Español would produce an Español. This shows that all of our Español designated ancestors likely had Native American blood, even if it said Español. A lot of times people will do their research and say, well, in the 1700s, all my ancestors said Español, so they're Spanish. Well, they were also, they had been whitened, if I can use that term, over the generations. And then if you look down, the terms are kind of insulting. A coyote was because of a mestindio and a castiza. A coyote and India produced a chamisco. So like a coyote is an animal, like we know it, it's like a coyote. Then you'll see the terms like mestizo sounds like mesteño, like a Mustang. And of course, from a black and an Indian, you get a lobo. That's a wolf. It's an animal. Very insulting terms. Part of this was to discourage the mixing of races, but that is the reality. And you won't see a lot of these. You won't see in New Mexico, but a lot of them you do see them in the marriage and baptismal records and burial records. I mentioned Genizaros here because they're an interesting part of our population, our casta system in the 1700s, and they're part of us. But the earliest time we hear this term is in the early 1700s by Vargas, Diego de Vargas, when he describes some Native Americans as Genizaros. It means janissary or auxiliary. It comes from the Ottoman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean world, where in the 1400s and 1500s, they would take young Christian boys and raise them as warriors. And they would be the ones they would send first into battle. They would be the buffer. Well, that's what it means here. In New Spain, Mexico in the colonial period, you'll see the term Ladino. That's also a term for highly Hispanicized native or Indian or one who spoke Spanish really well. But it's not Ladino like the language of the Sephardic Jews of Spain. That's something else. A lot of people think when they see the term Ladino in Mexican colonial records, they think, oh, they're Jewish. It's not. It means a Native American who's Hispanicized. In New Mexico, the Genízaros are non-Pueblo Native Americans, Navajos, Apaches, Comanches, Kiowa, Utes, and some Puebloans got caught up in this. They were cautivos or captives. They're captured by other nomadic native groups and put in captivity in Hispano households. They're servants, but it's also a slave class here in New Mexico, and they also become part of our ancestry. They're part of the humanity that interacts over the generations. These folks are catechized, but not really. They're baptized. They're given Christian names, and they're marginalized. They no longer belong to their tribes of origins, but they don't really belong in the Hispano towns. So they're on the periphery of New Mexican society. In 1733, we see the first attempt to have a community of Genízaros at Sandia. They're turned down, but the document is fascinating because it lists these people. They're here, and they list their tribal affiliations. By 1750, census records, the Genízaros are recorded at Taos, Rio Arriba, and South in Belén, which is a Genízaro community, and later at places like San Miguel del Vado. I'm going to talk a little bit about places like Abiquiu, because in the mid-1700s, the governor, Tomás Vélez Cachupín, he goes about establishing communities on the periphery of New Mexico. Again, Genízaro community and mixed blood people are put in these towns as buffers and culture brokers, in a sense, to present a bit of a wall, if you will, a wall of humanity between, on the one hand, the Nuevo Mexicanos and the Pueblo people, and on the other hand, the warring Comanche, Apache, and Navajo people who were formidable and are also part of the story. This is Abiquiu, established initially as a Hispano community around 1747, but it was abandoned because it was so dangerous to live in that area. But then by about 1754, Genízaros are established at Abiquiu. I love this picture from the 1890s of Abiquiu. It gives you an idea of what it looked like. It was a pueblo. It was a town of native peoples. But Hispanos are also established just down the river at Santa Rosa. And that's, we have a lot of people with names like Martinez, and Trujillo settling there. And again, interacting with these folks on every possible level. Oh, there's my information. I just gave it. I'm not going to repeat it. Just suffice to say, Abiquiu is one of these towns where Hispanic people start to blend with Genízaro people and are our ancestors and part of the casta system here in New Mexico. Oh. All right, Las Trampas. I love that town. If you've ever been up there, there's a fortress church. Here they are repairing it probably in the early 1900s. Las Trampas is another town where they took Genízaros and the excess mixed blood people from places like Taos, Santa Cruz de la Cañada, Santa Fe, and put them at places like Las Trampas. They were fortress towns. We know this because we get descriptions from priests and Bishop Tamaroni Romeral visits in 1760, and the people there asked permission to build this church, San Jose de Gracia, and he describes the town as being fortified. Fray Atanasio Dominguez in 1776 goes there, we'll see, and also describes the people and the town. Truchas is another one. These are beautiful mountain towns, but at the time, these were dangerous areas. So Truchas is another area where you have people with the Arellanes family, the Romero family. My own family on my father's side has roots in this area. Juan Domingo Romero and his wife Barbara Torres were from this area. So I'm going to go through some records of my own genealogy, my own personal family history to show this mixing going on, this casta blending and the designations as they show up in the documents. This is on my mom's side, a marriage at Sandia, the Sandia Pueblo, and on the 12th December, 1782. This is Josef Antonio Jaramillo. He's designated as an Español. He's marrying Juana Montoya, who's designated as mestiza. So she's considered at least half Native American. Josef Antonio Jaramillo, he's Espanol. Odds are he looked more Spanish, but he probably also had Native American blood as well. Here's another record from my mom's side of the family. This is a baptismal record from 1777 at Cochiti. Julian Ramon, he's listed as a mulatto, a vecino, that meant non-pueblo resident. And in the record, it says that he's the son of from the legitimate matrimony of Alonso Salas and Juana Maria Paez, vecinos of La Cañada de Cochiti. That was a little Hispanic town that was adjacent to the pueblo. And it says de calidad mulatos. It's interesting. Look at the priest signature down there. It's Fray Estanislao Mariano de Marulanda. I'm going to talk a little bit about him because in this period, in the 1770s, he shows up at Cochiti. He's assigned there, and he starts recording all of these Hispano people who are sometimes designated as Españoles. They start being designated by this priest as mulattos, half Spanish and half African. And he also, if he can't nail it down, he says de calidad mulato. We're going to see that's a loaded term. It doesn't just mean they looked part African. He was also saying they are of a lower class, a lower quality, de calidad mulato. Here's the burial record for Alonso Salas, the father. He's listed now, when he dies, he's listed as an Español. The reason I'm showing this is to show how fluid these designations can be. It could be de calidad mulato in one record and then Español in another record. Julian grows up, and his first marriage is to Dionisia de Jesus Padilla. This takes place at Cochiti. And there he is, Julian Ramon Salas. He's designated as mulatto and baptized, but now he's single and he's called an Español. So he's been elevated in the casta system in New Mexico, which goes to show that the people here obviously look a certain way, and the priests who come from places like Mexico or Spain have a difficult time sometimes categorizing us. So this priest, Fray Stanislao Mariano Marulanda, he was his mom's name was Ramirez, and that's important because he was born in Ozumba, Mexico, around 1734. His parents were Jose Antonio Marulanda and Estefania Ramirez. He was a first cousin to a renowned priest and scientist and historian and writer, Jose Antonio de Alzate y Ramirez. This is important. These are high-level people in Nueva España, in Mexico. When they're coming here, in their own mind, they're being sent to the sticks. They're being sent to the edge of empire. They're being sent to places that to them would be considered very uncivilized. There's a image of him. I put this here because I like to think that the priest here in New Mexico looked something like his cousin. But there's some indication that these families on the Ramirez side were related to Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Her full name was Juana Inés de Asbaje y Ramirez de Santiana. That's a high-level family in Mexico City, and she chose to put her father, her illegitimate father, her out-of-wedlock father, Asbaje, in her name to claim that lineage. So why does his pedigree matter? We don't descend from him or anything, but it's important to understand the documents and where these folks come from. He was a criollo. He was Spanish born in the Americas. New Mexicans were not criollos. The criollos are considered Spanish with no Native American blood. They held economic power in Mexico. They held church power alongside the Peninsulares. Those are Spaniards from Spain. but they held little or no political power and little or no military power. That was saved for Spaniards from Spain who were considered even above criollos. And so these criollos would lord what power they did have over mestizo populations and mulattoes in places like New Mexico. So that's why we have to understand that when we're reading these documents. And I'm going to get to how some of these folks described this throughout the centuries. So again, what is calidad? It means quality or status. It could be based on skin color, occupation, wealth, purity of blood or perceived purity of blood, honor or lack of honor, integrity, or place of origin. And it also designated a certain legitimacy on you or illegitimacy. Calidad was determined not only by skin color, but also social and moral attributes. I want to look at these casta paintings that we all see everywhere. These paintings were commissioned to illustrate the variety of intermixing taking place in the colonies in the Americas and in places like the Philippines in the 1600s and the 1700s. It was to help the king and queen get an idea of who they were ruling over, because they weren't going to come to Mexico or New Mexico for sure, or the Philippines. It was too far. But they had their subjects taken to them in the form of paintings and images. And we'll see they tell us a lot about what was going on in Mexico and New Mexico as well. So what was going on a lot of times was this whitening or washing. When you had an Español and an Indian have a child that was a mestizo, then having a child with an Española who had a castizo, who then had a child with an Español who was, voila, Español. And this went on over and over again. You'll see in your genealogies, Español marrying a mestizo, mestiza, or a castizo marrying a mestiza, or an indio marrying a castizo. It goes in so many and in all directions. So look at this image. De negro y de India sale lobo. So from an African and a Native American, you get a lobo. That's the designation. And these paintings sometimes were warnings not to mix the races. This is a very unpleasant domestic scene. It's violent. The child is caught in the middle. But we also see the kind of dishes they had, the foods they ate, and the kind of dress that they were required to use and wear. They had hard and fast rules. Again, not so much in New Mexico, where everyone pretty much dressed the same if you were from here. Español y negra mulatto, from a Spanish and African, a mulatto. This is a little bit more, look at this, a peaceful scene. The Español, who probably has some Native American blood somewhere, a generation or two back, but then with an African who dresses in her designated clothing, and the peaceful the child in, looks like colonial clothing. Here's another image of a mulata, the little child, half Spanish and half African. And you see the foods, the dishes, the dress, but also the violence, and the poor child caught in the middle there, having to deal with this. Español y mulata produce morisca. We see this term, it kind of goes back to Spain, Moor, but it doesn't mean a Moor. It means somebody who is, let's see, Español and mulatto, that'd be somebody who's more Spanish than anything, but with like a quarter African. And there's their little child with them. There's another morisca. This is less peaceful. Obviously, the child is not too happy with dad, and neither is the mom. The mom has her hands on her hips, like, I don't know what she's saying. You can imagine, where have you been? What have you been doing? And he's going, the neighbors, keep it down. So again, there's that warning that it's not good to blend the races. But we got to remember, there's the ideal and the real. The ideal for the Spanish officials was, don't do this. The reality is it was happening a lot and all the time. De Español y de India produce mestizo. There's your mestizo. Mestizo is probably the highest number of people were mestizos in Mexico and in New Mexico in these communities. Very few were Español or of only African. You'll see mainly there was mixture going on. the mestizo y de India sale coyote. There's that term coyote. Today, coyote means a child of a Hispanic and an American of Anglo or Northern European ancestry. But back then it was somebody who was mestizo and native, their child, meaning mainly Native American, but with some Spanish. De español y mestiza, castiza, castizo. We've heard this term. It just means more or less Spanish, but with some Native American, 25%, more or less. And of course, from a castizo and an española produce española. That little child there is considered española, but clearly she has Native American ancestry on mom's side and dad's side, more than likely. So there's your series of casta paintings. They're very fascinating and interesting, and we can learn a lot about our ancestors just by studying these paintings. So these images are static in a way. They're flat images, but they also tell us about the racial mixing and blending and cultural attributes and mixing taking place in the 1600s, 1700s, and well into the 1800s in Mexico and in New Mexico. But they don't tell us everything about the lives of the castas. They just tell us some things. And again, I repeat, some are warnings about and against mixing races. Again, a very racially charged society in the Spanish Empire in the 1700s. So a little bit about Africans and mulattoes in New Mexico. I always remind people that African history starts in New Mexico in 1539. Esteban the Moor, he's the first official representative of Spain to the pueblos at Cibola, Zuni. They kill him, but nonetheless, that is when African history begins here. There was a colonist, Alvaro Garcia Delgado, who's designated as a mulatto. He came with Oñate in 1598, and he settles here. In fact, his wife gets caught up in some witchcraft. Again, it tends to be the mixed bloods who are accused of brujeria and hechiceria, and his family is one of these families, and they're common ancestors to all of us. Another person that came with Oñate, Cristobal López de Áviles, was from, I find this interesting, he was designated as being from Oviedo in Spain, but he was a mulatto. So that tells us there was mixing going on in Spain, and people were coming here with that designation. He was described as swarthy and black-bearded. That made me think of our common ancestor, Bartolomé Romero, who came from Corral de Almaguer, Spain. He's the first Romero here. He was described as swarthy and black-bearded, dark-skinned. And it made me think, was he a mulatto? I don't know, maybe not, but he was a colonist who settled here and had the same description as Cristobal López de Áviles. There were black slaves that were part of the 1598 expedition, and some escaped, we find in the documents. Diego de Vargas brought an African drummer with him and a town crier named Sebastián de Rodríguez, who established a family in New Mexico. In fact, his offspring, his sons, helped establish the town of Las Trampas, either his sons or grandsons, I don't remember. Salvador was one of them, one of my ancestors. So you have his family founding Las Trampas with other mixed blood people of many racial backgrounds. Let's go to some descriptions that some of the Spanish priests left us to find out about ourselves. In 1631, Fray Esteban de Perea said that the inhabitants of New Mexico are made up of so many mestizos, mulattoes, and others who are worse. That's not very nice. He said that they're dangerous and of little moral strength. He clearly didn't like the people here or the place. He was sometimes embarrassed by the local people of New Mexico, and it felt that the local Native American people, the Pueblo people, were a bad influence on the Hispanic people. Fray Alonso de Posada in 1661 said, New Mexico has no more than 100 citizens, vecinos, that he described us as mulattoes, mestizos, and all have Spanish blood, though it is slight, meaning not a lot. Fray Francisco Atanasio Dominguez, I mentioned him, in 1776. He was an explorer to Salt Lake City. It wasn't a city there yet, but he and Escalante. They both went up there in that time period. But he did an inventory of New Mexico's people and churches. And about the people of Santa Cruz, and this applies to Santa Fe and Albuquerque too, he said, suffice to say that most of them pass for Spaniards. But again, that's a loaded term. He means that a lot of them passed as, they look more or less Spanish, but there's still something going on there. And also they are not supposed to be trying to pass for Spaniards. That was against the law. But in New Mexico, things were a little bit loose and fluid. About the people of Las Trampas, who are my people, for the most part, they are a ragged lot. They are as festive as they are poor and very merry. They're low class, and there are very few of good or even moderately good blood. Wow. Fray Ambrosio Guerra in 1801, about the people of Albuquerque, he said, all our vecinos, most are genizaros, which is a mixture of various native nations, and the rest are mulattos, coyotes, and a few Spanish, although most consider themselves Spanish without it being so. They speak no other language other than poorly understood Castilian, meaning Spanish. And already he's knocking how we speak Spanish, because by 1801, we had our own lingo, our own way of doing it, a mix of Old Spanish, a mix of Mexican words and Mexican Nahuatl words, Puebloan words, Genizaro words, and pronunciation from all of these people comes into our Spanish. It's not just one thing. It's not possible. It can't be. Again, I want to reiterate, passing for Spanish. Another wrote, many pass for Spaniards who in their own hearts know they are mulattoes. I'm not quite sure what that means. I think what he's saying is that he was saying that mainly the people here are mixed blood, but they say they are Espanol or Spanish. Passing as a Spaniard was a serious threat to the maintenance and alignment of the social order, which required constant management and surveillance. In other words, these priests like Marulanda or the viceroy or the governors that were appointed here from Spain, they didn't want the lower classes to be considering themselves equal to them, because they had the power, they had the authority, they had the wealth, and they did not want to share. But nonetheless, people maneuvered that system, as we saw. So let's look at this term Espanol. Sometimes I wonder, is it useless? I mean, in a sense, it is, in the sense that it doesn't really tell us the whole truth about our ancestry. But in some contexts, it is helpful, I think, to tell us where our folks operated in colonial society. But again, in New Mexico, it did not mean you were from Spain or that you only had Spanish ancestry. It meant that you more or less lived a Spanish life, speaking Spanish and being Catholic. And you might have looked the part and had some ethnic attributes. But again, it didn't mean there was no Native American admixture going on. So a little bit about New Mexico castas. I'm not going to touch on some of the families from the Oñate period, because I know Jose Esquivel is giving a talk about that, and he'll do a great job with that. But I want to look at some families that I've researched that have shown casta backgrounds. The Sayago Arroyo family, this is a family that marries into the Tafoya family. Margarita Sayago de Gonzalez was the daughter of Diego Sayago Arroyo of Mexico City and Teresa Dominguez de Mendoza. There's that Dominguez Mendoza family of New Mexico. Diego was the son of Diego de Arroyo and Maria de la Mora. This couple was of casta origin, which is fascinating because those Españoles Mexicanos families that Vargas brought in 1693 were supposed to be just Spanish families, not castas. And so when they came here, they were called Españoles. But when you do their genealogy, you find Simón de Arroyo married Maria de Mora in 1684 in Mexico City. She's listed as a huérfana, but when you start to dig into this family, you'll see Simón was a viudo, a widower of Juana de Zuleta. So I went and looked for their records, and there's their records that says Simón de Arroyo, he's mulatto, and Juana de Zuleta is mulata. There's the transcription and translation. I won't read the whole thing, but it says that he was a mulatto libre. He was a free black or free mulatto. And same with her, Juana de Zuleta. They were both from Mexico City.
Rob, let me
Yes.
interrupt a second. It's 11:45, so.
All right, well, I will move quickly through these next slides. Afán de Rivera, Francisco Afán de Rivera, I found his will in Parral, did his genealogy. His parents were castas, moriscos in Mexico City. There's some images from his will. There's the parents' marriage record designating them as such. He was in the book of Españoles, even though he came from a casta family. The Vigil family, suffice to say, we know that Francisco Montes Vigil, all indications are he was mulatto. We know that when he and his wife have children down in Aguascalientes, they're designated as being part African. So there's the modern day casta system, DNA. I love doing DNA, but gets me a little nervous. I show up as part European, part Native American with Middle Eastern, Jewish, and other miscellaneous DNA. It's a mix, and this is how we all are here in New Mexico. Mainly, we have 80% Spanish Y DNA for New Mexicans on the paternal line and 80% Native American on the mitochondrial DNA. My own mom's mitochondrial DNA haplogroup is B. My father's is JM172. So this shows the complexities of Spanish colonial caste in New Mexico, casta. Individuals moved freely, and there was a lot of fluidity in New Mexico, how castas in New Spain became españoles in New Mexico, and they're part of our story and part of our ancestry. Here's a quote from Octavio Paz I'm going to finish with. I love this quote. The strange food, the colors, the landscapes, the women with different skin and eyes, Indian, mestizo, mulatto, the complicity of the sun and the vegetation, the voluptuousness of the climate, all this stirred the imagination, the senses. And there's my casta family photo from 1970. That's droopy guy at the bottom is me and my sister Doris, my dad Roberto, my mom Ramona, and my sisters Debbie and Maxine, and my brother Lorenzo at the top. That's it. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Rob. I really appreciated it, and I'm sure everybody else did. At this time, we're going to be open for questions. I know we're supposed to do the chat, but we're a small enough group. I think you can unmute yourself if you're going to talk and ask a question, and you can play your video if you'd like as well. So now let's open it up to questions.
Hi, Rob. I have a question for you about
Yes.
the archives. I'm
Yes.
going to be visiting Albuquerque back in October, and I'd like to review kind of the Spanish archive microfilm.
Yes.
Is that all going to be open at that time?
Spanish archives, the microfilm for SANM1 and SANM2, yes, they're available at the New Mexico State Record Center and Archives, but you could see them in other places, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure they're available in other places. Right now, we have limited hours. We're open Tuesdays and Wednesdays from 10 to 1 by appointment only. So you need to, everybody take notes. The email is archives@state.nm.us. I'll repeat that. archives@state.nm.us. So we're open 2 days. It's limited. It's very limited. You want to get an appointment ahead of time. And again, make sure if you're coming from out of town, especially, make sure you call and confirm, because as you know, things can change in this current situation. We just opened on Monday, and we weren't open till Tuesday, but officially we opened Monday, the building, and there was a guy there. He came in all the way from Texas, and he didn't have an appointment. I'm like, well, you're gonna have to get an appointment. You have to do it through the email, and so make sure you do it way ahead of time, because they're gonna be pretty strict for now. This is all for now, because we're also hiring a new archivist. If you go to the State Personnel Office website, where they list jobs, there's an archivist position open. And when they get a new archivist in place, I think they'll increase the hours that they're open.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Rob, this is Frank Dominguez.
Yes.
I thought it was interesting that one priest, was it Marulanda? Was that his last name?
Yes.
Was tied into Alzate, and of course, the famous Alzate map.
Yeah.
Did Alzate actually come up to New Mexico and visit his cousin?
No, not that I'm aware of. That doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Yeah.
I put that in there because I just found it to be a fascinating connection. And I also wanted people to see that these were very high level people, and they came here and looked down on us.
Right.
You know, for that guy, you know, people have told me, well, they weren't mulattoes at Cochiti. They were just sunburned by working outside a lot. And I'm like, maybe, and even if they were mulattoes, that's fine too. That tells us something about our history. But the more interesting thing to me is the calidad mulatto. He was really knocking down the people, because back then that would have been saying you're of a lower class, you're of a lower quality of person.
Right. Okay, thank you.
You got it.
Rob, I have a question for you.
Yes.
I have been researching the Atencio family.
Yes.
And everything I find with them, it says Espanol. Even when
Yes.
they're in Abiquiu, it's
Yeah.
listed as Espanol.
Mhm.
Do you have any insight on the Atencio family?
Yeah, the Atencio family, they were originally called Atienza. They were Atienza, and they came in 1693 with those Mexico City colonists. They were from Puebla, and they were part of a group of people who were from the area of Brihuega in outside of Toledo. They were in that. Actually, it's a little bit northeast of Madrid in Spain. And a group of these folks left that area, Brihuega, and they immigrated to Puebla in Mexico, and they were weavers. So I think some of our weaving traditions come from these folks. So they're up here. Here's the thing. When they came from Spain, they were Españoles. They were Español. But when if you look at the book like that Colligan and Esquivel did, the Spanish colonization of New Mexico, it's very typical. You'll see a person will say they're from Brihuega, Spain, and then you look at their marriage record, and it says, and they married Maria de Iziguirre or something. I'm just making up a name. I don't know. And then their child is born in Puebla and marries a local woman named Juana Gongaza or something. I'm making up names. And they're from there. All these women that they're marrying are more than likely of mixed blood ancestry. These are not high-level people. The Atienzas were not of the same class as the Marulandas. Okay? None of these people who came up here were. None of them were. They were not of the noble classes. They did not have coats of arms. They did not have any of that. They were, if you were a weaver, you were kind of like middle class. You know, you were of the merchant class. So when they come up here, these groups at first tended to marry each other, at least initially, because they were marrying of the same group. But out of the gate, if you start looking at the Atencios, all of a sudden they start marrying these group that came from Zacatecas in 1695, the Lovatos, the Vigil, the Armijos, the Armijo de Duran. And those people are of mixed blood ancestry. They're the book on Juan Paez de Hurtado that Colligan did, it says they were mainly mestizos and mulattos. So they're marrying these people, and then they're marrying the New Mexicans who were kicked out and stayed, wanting to come back after the Pueblo revolt. Most of those folks are also mestizos. So no one gets out of that. They can't possibly marry only one kind of person down 12 generations. It's mathematically impossible. So yeah, you'll find people in Abiquiu, but that's what I mentioned earlier. You have the Martin Serranos, the Father Martinez. I descend from his little sister. They're up there in Abiquiu, Antonio Severino Martin and his wife, Maria del Carmen Santisteban. They're designated as Españoles, but come on, he descends from Martin Serrano, who they're all anyone Martin Serrano is part Native American, and they're marrying Valdez, who were from Spain, probably about 6 or 5 generations before, but they're also marrying people from Mexico City. It's a mix. To say the Atencios of Abiquiu, when they say they're Español, that they were of the Español class of the casta system. I think I need to clarify. Español is a casta designation in this case, because they weren't from Spain. They were from Spain 5 generations, 6 generations back. Does that make sense? But only some of their ancestors were from Brihuega, not all of them.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I have a question. How did they classify the Jewish people
They didn't.
in Mexico? They didn't?
No, it was illegal to be Jewish. New Mexico did not have Jews living here. You had people of Jewish ancestry, some of them possibly doing some practices that went back to their Jewish ancestors, maybe knowing what they were doing it secretly, or maybe doing it and not even knowing why they were doing it. So New Mexico was not a colony of Judaizantes, of crypto Jews. We have one case of a person being accused of Judaizante. That was Francisco Gomez Robledo in the 1650s, 1660s. He's accused. Even he is brought up here, and he establishes his life here after that. There's a reason we're showing 5% Jewish, 4% Jewish, because we descend from the Jews who stayed in Spain after the Alhambra decree of 1492, the expulsion. The ones who left and stayed Jewish, we don't descend from them. I think there's a lot of confusion. When I read articles, it'll say the Jews were expelled from Spain and then came to New Mexico. That's not what happened. The Jews that stayed there were assimilated and became part of the greater population. Again, some practicing their religion of their ancestors, which makes sense that they would do that. Many just converted genuinely. And so that's why we don't show 60% or 50% Sephardic Jewish. My mom shows 11%, which I think is kind of high for a New Mexican. But no, if New Mexico had Jewish, when I say Jewish, I mean people practicing Judaism here, the Inquisition would have been all over it, and we'd have a lot of legajos of cases of Judaizante. What New Mexicans had, the colonists that came with Oñate and later with Vargas, probably a lot of them had Jewish ancestry, also Moorish ancestry. That's why we're also showing 5 to 10% North African, the Moors. They were Muslims.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? We have a couple of minutes.
Rob, this is Frank Dominguez, going to have one more question.
Yes.
In the Parral archives, there's a list of Portuguese,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yes.
some people will make them equivalent to Jews. Was there such a list also in New Mexico archives where they set aside the Portuguese and made them pay an additional tax?
No,
Okay.
not the short answer is there that I'm aware of. There's nothing that in New Mexico. There might have been. That was around 1633. That
Yes.
list.
Yes.
All of our documents, except for a handful from before 1680, are gone.
That's true. I forget that. Yeah.
So
okay.
there may have been, but not that I'm aware of. That doesn't mean there wasn't one. But that list you mentioned is really fascinating because we have some common ancestors there. Manuel Jorge is in that list.
Exactly. Right.
And
Right.
we have to remember around in the late 1500s, Portugal was taken over by Spain. And I think for about 50 years or so, Portugal was under Spanish rule. But then Portugal wrestled herself away from Spain around 1625 to 1630 in that time period. Well, a lot of the people who didn't want to come under the authority of the Inquisition left Spain and went to Portugal. So they become kind of the enemy. And,
Right.
and so they're rounded up and they are considered, sometimes they're considered synonymous with Jews, which could be true for certain individuals.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Some of my ancestors are tied into that Jorge family. So yeah, my Dominguez Gonzalez.
I think all of us have that. Yeah, Antonio
Yeah.
Jorge de Vera into the Montaño family. I have that like 2 or 3 times in my
Yeah,
family.
except my roots are in Nueva Vizcaya, not New Mexico. Yeah.
Yeah.
We stayed down south. Thank you.
There you go. We're all primos with the Mexicanos, especially in the state of Chihuahua. There are New Mexicans who live there from the Pueblo Revolt period. They're all
Exactly.
primos.
Right. Thank you.
You got it.
Okay, well, unfortunately, our time is up. We want to thank Rob. We wish we could continue, but Rob has other appointments, so we can't keep him any longer. But thank you very much, Rob. We really appreciate your time, and thank everybody for attending, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much. Muchas gracias. See you tomorrow for the Musicat.
Yes.